Good morning. Scripture is from Revelation chapter 17, verses 8 to 18. You can see it in your church bulletin or also on the screen. And I'm reading from the New International Version. Revelation 17, verse 8. The beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. The inhabitants of the earth, whose names have not been written in the book of life from the creation of the world, will be astonished when they see the beast, because it once was, now is not, and yet will come. This calls for a mind with wisdom. The 7 heads are 7 hills on which the woman sits. There are also 7 kings. 5 have fallen. 1 is, the other has not yet come. But when he does come, he must remain for only a little while. The beast who once was and now is not is an 8th king. He belongs to the 7 and is going to his destruction. The 10 horns you saw are 10 kings who have not yet received a kingdom, but who for 1 hour will receive authority as kings along with the beast. They have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast. They will wage war against the Lamb, but the Lamb will triumph over them, because he is Lord of lords and King of kings, and with him will be his called, chosen, and faithful followers. Then the angel said to me, "The waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. The beast and the 10 horns you saw will hate the prostitute. They will bring her to ruin and leave her naked. They will eat her flesh and burn her with fire. For God has put into their hearts to accomplish his purpose by agreeing to hand over to the beast their royal authority. Until God's words are fulfilled, the woman you saw is the great city that rules over the kings of the earth." May God bless the reading of his word.
You know, I was thinking this past week, I've been in the pastoral ministry for over 20 years now. And in that time, I have written probably thousands of sermons and messages. But I don't know that I've struggled over any series as I have this one, especially since we finished Revelation 3 on the 7 churches of Revelation. And I spent a lot of time in prayer this week, and I spent a lot of time in reflection, asking myself why I was having such a difficult time putting this message together. And it wasn't for what might be the obvious reason. It wasn't that I was having such a difficult time understanding it. I actually understood it more than I thought. At least I think I understood it more than I thought I was going to. But the problem came in trying to figure out how to communicate what we find in this chapter 17, to the congregation in a way that makes sense, that's relatable, that's comprehensible. And I asked myself, why is that such a difficult challenge this time, more than other times? And it's because that in the scripture that David read so well this morning, we are confronted with realities that if we read about them anywhere other than in Holy Scripture, would have a kind of cartoonish or at least science fiction aspect to it. I mean, we're talking about dragons and beasts and false prophets and prostitutes. And when we read through this, we think, my gosh, is this real? What is happening? In fact, I was told this week by someone in all seriousness that they wondered if John had lost it all or if he was smoking something when he had this vision. And perhaps you're thinking that as well. And the reason it's so hard for us to grasp this, the reason it's so hard to communicate is that we are dealing with realities that, frankly, even for the Christian community, are foreign to our North American, our Western, materialistic culture. And this materialistic worldview has infected not just the secular world, but it's infected the church as well. And I would wager that most of us spend most of our time without a conscious awareness of the spiritual world around us. And that is why it's so hard. And to understand Revelation, to understand this chapter, we have to understand that the spiritual world is all around us. There is a thin veil separating this world from the other world. And they are not diametrically opposed. There's interactions between the two, and it's those interactions that Revelation is dealing with. And we struggle with this because we are part of a culture, even though we're believers, even though we acknowledge God, we acknowledge the existence of the spiritual world, we are part of a culture in the West that denies the reality of the spiritual world, and it has infected us. It has infected me. I remember some years ago when I was a student at Acadia, I had a close friend who was from Africa. And he told me one day, we were sitting in the Student Union building, and it was around exam time, and he said that the previous day he'd had a terrible toothache. And he said, I didn't have time to go to the dentist because I had an important exam to study for. And so I asked the Lord to take away the pain from the toothache just long enough for me to study and write the exam. And I said to him, well, what happened? And he said, well, the pain went away. And I said, well, that's amazing. That's incredible. I mean, you prayed for your toothache to go away and it just went away. And he looked at me in disbelief and he said, you Canadians. He said, for an African, it's the most natural thing in the world. I had a toothache. I couldn't look after it because I had to study for the exam. I asked the Lord to take it away, and he took it away. He said, what did you expect the Lord would do? And I realized that I talk about miracles. I preach on miracles. But when something happens that goes against a materialistic worldview, it shocks me. It amazes me. And somehow, if this chapter, and indeed if this book of Revelation is going to mean anything to us, we have to get beyond that materialistic worldview and recognize that the spiritual world is all around us. And there is a God, and there is an evil one called Satan, or in the book of Revelation, the dragon. There are angels, there are demons, and these spiritual realities are at play all around us. Indeed, there is a war going on. And until we recognize that the church, is supposed to be front and center in the midst of this war, we are going to miss out on what God intends for us to be and to do. I'm told that in Germany, if you go to the house where Martin Luther lived for years and studied and prayed and lived, that on one wall you'll see a stain, a large ink stain. And the story is that he was one day in this great battle with Satan, and he threw the bottle of ink at him. And that strikes us today as bizarre, but it was part of the reality. And the things that we read in Revelation may strike you as bizarre, but let me tell you, if you come from some countries who are part of our church, in Africa, in South America, in parts of Asia, they recognize much more than we do in Canada the reality of the spiritual world all around us. In fact, if you talk to, in our congregation, some of the retired missionaries, they are aware of the spiritual world much more than we are. I've talked to Marshall and Hazel. Let me tell you, the stories they tell are just mind-blowing of the experiences that they've had overseas, but they tell them matter-of-factly because it's become a part of their worldview to understand and accept and recognize this. And let me encourage you, whenever you have opportunity, just sit at the feet of Marshall and Hazel and listen to their stories. And we're confronted in chapter 17 with some absolutely mind-boggling images. And we're confronted with a being who's called the Beast. And I've jumped ahead to chapter 17 because we have to know who the characters are before the rest of Revelation is going to make any sense. And one of the central characters is the Beast. Now, the Beast has a spiritual reality and a physical reality. In the spiritual reality, he's called the dragon. It's Satan. His name in Revelation is the dragon. It is Satan, the evil one. And on earth, his identity is the beast. In heaven, or the spiritual realm, he's the dragon. In the earthly realm, he's the beast. And everything that the beast does, everything that the dragon does, is simply a twisted, distorted parody of God's creative beauty. For example, we worship the Christ. And so we're introduced in the scriptures to the Antichrist. We worship the Trinity, the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. In Revelation, the evil one wants us to worship the unholy Trinity, the dragon, the beast, the false prophet. And just as Jesus said, I am the Alpha and the Omega, who is and who was and who is to come, we're told that the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction, is to come. Now, the only difference is that the beast goes to his destruction, whereas Jesus comes to his own. And then in verse 9, we're told this calls for a mind with wisdom. In other words, we have to understand the spiritual perspective that's being presented here. We have to somehow get beyond our materialistic worldview to understand the spiritual nature of what's happening. Down in verse 10, we're told that there are 7 kings. Now, the number 7, you've heard me say this before, is symbolic of the totality of something. It represents the fullness, the completeness of something. And so the 7 kings represent the totality of human sovereignty within history. It's not just a definable list of emperors, but it represents the powers in our world, in our culture, all through history. We're told in verse 10 that 5 have fallen, the 6th is ruling. A 7th will come to power briefly, concluding with a grand finale, the 8th one, in which humanity approaches the end of its tether. So in other words, the end of time is approaching, and great horrors are going to come upon this world. And in the midst of that, a king will come who is a monster before whom all others will pale. He will be the final embodiment of cosmic evil. He will be the final embodiment of cosmic evil. And he will be the reanimation, symbolically, of the spirit of the first Roman emperor to persecute Christians. Do you know who that was? Nero. The first Roman emperor to persecute Christians. Now, Nero died by suicide in AD 68. And a myth grew up that he wasn't really dead. Those of you who are old enough will remember when Hitler committed suicide. A myth grew up that he wasn't really dead, and there are supposed Hitler sightings all over the world. Those of you a little bit younger than that, but still relatively along, will remember that when Elvis Presley died, there were rumors that Elvis hadn't died, and there were Elvis sightings all over the world, including the White House. He was supposedly there, living with the president. And the myth said that Nero had secretly fled to Parthia, which was Rome's great superpower enemy to the east. And from there, he was plotting a vengeful return. And so the name Nero in John's day had become synonymous for all that is evil, and deservedly so. The crimes of Nero make him one of the worst criminals in all of history. He was responsible for the death of his mother. He arranged the murder of his first wife. He kicked his second wife to death when she was pregnant with his child. He set fire to Rome until the city burned for 7 days and nights, and the citizens were united in a hopeless bond of misery. And then he blamed the fire on Christians, and he tortured them by rolling them in pitch, setting them alight, and using them as living torches in his garden, or by sewing them into the skins of wild animals and setting savage hunting dogs on them to tear them to pieces. There's scarcely a crime in the calendar that Nero did not commit. And that is why in Revelation he becomes the prototype, the symbol of this last king who is going to embody his spirit. Now notice what it says in verses 13 and 14. This is key to this message, and it's key to this entire series. When talking about the dragon and the beast and the kings, it says in verse 13, they have one purpose and will give their power and authority to the beast, the embodiment of Satan on earth, and they will wage war against the Lamb. Now that's what Revelation is all about. It's about a war between the beast and the Lamb, between those who are followers of the beast and those who are followers of the Lamb. And the problem, I've become convinced that the problem with the church in North America today is that we have forgotten we are engaged in a war. And that's why the book of Revelation is so important. Its message is so important because it reminds us what we are involved in. And when I see some of the things And not just in this church, but I've been involved in a lot of churches. I see a lot of churches. When I see the things that Christians get worked up about, and excuse me for saying this, but sometimes the pettiness that we show to one another, we have forgotten that we are engaged in spiritual warfare. We've forgotten how high the stakes are, how serious the stakes are. We've forgotten that we're at war. One of the heroes in my life is my father. And he died a couple of years ago, just short of his 97th birthday. And he fought in World War II. He signed up with the Royal Canadian Air Force. He was a flight engineer. And during the war, he was shot down over England. He was the last one in his plane to bail out. Only he and one other person survived the crash. He bailed out at 40 feet. His parachute didn't have time to open. He crashed to the earth, had a fractured skull, almost died. His mother was sent a letter that he was missing and presumed dead. And my father did that. And in fact, not just my father, but a whole generation of people sacrificed like that because they recognized that they were at war against a monstrous evil called Nazism. And the only way that they were going to be victorious is if they were willing to make whatever sacrifice was necessary. My friends, you and I are engaged in a war against a monstrous evil. And the only way the church in North America will emerge victorious is if we are willing to make whatever sacrifice is necessary. I've said this before, that so often when a change comes to the church or something's proposed to me, the first question I ask myself is this going to add to my workload? Is this going to inconvenience me? Rather than asking what should be the first question in a war, how will this help our church's outreach? You've heard me say before that the church is the only institution in society that exists primarily for the benefit of those who are not its members. And every decision we make should be based on what is going to help our church's outreach and support the Lamb in the war against the beast. I love a conversation that Bill Hybels had a number of years ago. He went to a banquet and he was sitting next to a 4-star general. The general didn't know him and he asked what he did, and he said, "Well, I'm a pastor of a church." And the general kind of smiled and he said, "You know, sometimes I wish I was the pastor of a church." He said, "It's such a heavy responsibility holding the lives of thousands of men under my care." And Hybels responded, "Well, you know, sometimes I wish I was a 4-star general, because it's such a burden having the lives of thousands of people, the spiritual lives of thousands of people under my care." And that's what the book of Revelation is about. We're engaged in a war. The book of Revelation, this chapter, the entire book, is about a continuing war and the role of the 7 churches, all churches, in that warfare. We must never forget that it is the beast's very business to make war not only against Christ, but as it says in chapter 13, verse 7, against the saints, because we are with the Lamb. We are engaged in the war because we are with the Lamb. And if we are going to be effective in this war, we have to recognize that in many ways as Christians, I talked about this last week, in many ways as Christians and as churches, we have compromised with our culture. It's not all our fault. That materialistic culture is all around us. But consequence to that, we have compromised. And so I want to take just a couple of minutes. I know time's going on, but I want to take a couple of minutes. I guess I can't move because the mic's not working. I want you to think for a moment, and I want you to shout out loudly, tell me some ways that you have seen the church, not necessarily our church, but the church in North America compromise. How have we compromised? Okay, taking prayer out of schools. That could be one way. What else? Pardon? Yes. There is a church that has an atheist as a minister. That's a compromise theologically. It's not holding to the truths of the Scriptures as found in the Bible. How else have we compromised? Our belief about the truth of the Bible. Yes, goes back to what Jean was just saying. Not staking our lives on this. How else do churches compromise? Watering down the message so that it's comfortable, so it doesn't make us squirm a little bit. I'll tell you, when I read the Scriptures, it makes me squirm. I become uncomfortable. And that's a good thing. The day I don't squirm, then there's something wrong. What else? Okay, churches compromise. That's a good one, Marg. Often by not caring about the people around them. And our church, we've made a conscious decision that we are a downtown church and we're going to reach out to our downtown community. Did you know that in the early church, in the early years of the church, the vast majority of believers were from the lower classes? Because the church was the only place they could find equality, acceptance, and love. But today, in North America, the vast majority of believers are middle and upper class people. And many churches have forgotten to reach out to the lower classes. When we ignore racism around us, we are compromising with our culture. And it's been in the papers all the time, the violence that we're seeing in our culture against women. Rape, sexual assault, sexual harassment. You can't open the paper a single day or go on a blog without hearing about it. And of course, a well-known Hollywood producer has had his whole life and career come crashing down because of decades of sexual abuse and harassment, purportedly. Anything else? Respect for the individual. Yes. Recognizing the value of the individual before God. Giving up Christmas. Yes. Pardon? Not meeting the budget. That's an excellent one. I'll tell you something. I said this in the first service. There is absolutely no reason why a church with our size, with our resources, should ever struggle to meet its budget. And I've had to ask myself, and Yvette and I have had conversations, are we giving enough? Or have we compromised with our culture and we're spending so much on ourselves that we're not having enough to give to the church? But how we spend our money is one of the ways that people compromise, Christians compromise. Excellent suggestion, Ralph. That's right. No, discipline in what we give, yes. And if the church has the wrong priorities, then that's an important discussion that we need to have. Yeah. Anything else? So recognizing that the church is called to be consistently pro-life throughout the life cycle. Now the reason I bring this up is not because you have to agree with them all. We can have various opinions. But we need to start asking ourselves the question, what does it mean to compromise? Am I compromising? Is my church compromising? Is the church in North America compromising? We have to start asking ourselves those questions, because if we don't, we've already fallen into the trap that the enemy has sprung before us, and we're not part of the war that the Lamb has called us to be. I wish we had a lot more time. I would go into it a lot more. But it's so important for the rest of Revelation to recognize that we are engaged in a war, and the greatest danger in this war is compromise. And each one of us has to ask before the Lord, what does it mean to compromise? What does it look like to compromise? We may disagree with one another, that's fine. But as long as we're asking the questions.